All right, so we're back with Thomas Taylor, his dissertation on Aristotle's philosophy. We're looking at the natural motion of bodies and the upward and the downward and the causes, more specifically, of gravity and levity. So let's back up a little bit from where we left off and just kind of get back into the text. Um, Okay. So, oh yeah, and this was a interesting idea. And for anything to tend to its own place is nothing else than to tend to its own form. So, the proper place of a thing is tied to its proper form for Aristotle. Um, we kind of interpreted that in terms of Platonic metaphysics as well as Aristotelian cosmology, and it's something important to remember. Um, We'll keep going. Thus, therefore, that which is said by the ancients may be more readily admitted, viz., that the similar tends to the similar, for this does not entirely happen to be the case. So the position that is the natural place of a natural body has something in common with the natural body. So that's one way in which the similar tends to the similar. Thus, if anyone could transfer the Earth to the place where the moon now is, each of its parts would not tend to it, but to the place in which it is now situated. In short, this must necessarily happen to things similar and without difference from the same motion, so as that whither any part tither, also the whole is naturally adapted to tend. Okay. So if all of the parts of Earth naturally tend towards the center, the whole of Earth will move that way. But since place is the boundary of that which contains, and upward and downward, the extremity in the middle contain everything that is moved, and since this, after a certain manner, becomes the form of that which is contained, hence, for a thing to tend to its own place is to tend to that which is similar. Okay, so we talked about the different elements being the forms of the other elements. So fire is the form of air because we've already said that the proper place of a thing is part of its proper form. And so fire rings around air. It's a concentric ring cosmology. So fire is, in a certain sense, the proper place of air because it encompasses it. So a place is, what does he say? It's like the boundary of the containing vessel. The place of a thing is the boundary of that which contains it. So the proper place then of air is defined by fire, and air wants to tend to fire. And that makes sense kind of geometrically in that the fire contains the air, and similar tends to similar. Air wants to tend towards its proper form. But also in the other direction, like earth is the proper form of water, and water tends down to earth. And that's where I think the logic doesn't quite work, and there seems to be like two parallel lines of logic. If you took Aristotle's line consistently, then it would seem that the higher elements are always going to be the form of the lower elements. But then Aristotle seems to indicate also that earth is the form of water, and Simplicius backs that up with his own interpretation. In a way that like is a separate line of reasoning. So there seems to be two slightly contradictory lines of reasoning going on here. That's what we identified last time, but we'll keep going here. For things which are successive are similar to each other, as for instance water to air and air to fire. The contrary, however, may be asserted of the media, but not of the extremes, as for instance that air is similar to water and water to earth. For always that which is higher is to that which is under it as form to matter. So, right, that which is higher would indicate that always the more rarefied element should be the form to that which is lower by Aristotle's own text, his own statements. But then we have this contrary idea, and I'm wanting to review it again. So let's just review Simplicius on this point. If anyone wishes to find more proximately the tendency to the similar, he will find it to be the tendency of a thing to its own place. For since place is the boundary of that which contains, that which tends to its proper place tends to the boundary of that which contains. So in a certain respect, the center also contains, because the extremities are the upper boundary, the lower boundary, and the middle. And so, well, the center of the Earth, although it's a point, is kind of the boundary of the downward moving elements. But okay. That's what I mean by this parallel line of reasoning. By this statement, for always that which is higher is to that which is under it as form to matter, but then also the center of the earth, and earth acts as a form to water as it descends and constitutes that proper place and thus form for it. So these are two separate ideas that I think are just kind of being hodgepodge together. We're going to keep on reading this. I know it's all review now, but let's just go with it. But that which contains is similar to that which is contained, because things successive are similar to each other. So things that are next to each other by nature are also similar. They also will contain one another. Thus, water is similar to air and air to fire, and vice versa. In the middle elements, it is true to say that air is not only similar to fire, but also to water. So it's similar to whatever is adjacent to it, so that it is similar both to that which is placed above it and to that which is placed beneath it. In like manner, water is similar to air and to earth, but the extremes, viz. Fire and earth, have no longer this similitude. For neither has fire any element above it, nor earth any element beneath it. That similars, however, are successive is evident from their being easily changed into each other, being of a kindred nature according to the common quality inherent in them. According to this, perhaps, fire and earth subsist vice versa, having the common quality dryness. Okay, so in another respect, fire and earth do have something in common, because the elements, of course, have hot, cold, dry, wet. So fire is dry and hot. Earth is cold and dry. So they both have dryness. So not in respect of proximity locally, but in terms of the proximity of these qualities, fire and earth are next to each other and can exchange between each other by virtue of the common quality that they share. This also seems like a kind of separate idea from what he just said, but we'll keep going. But having said that place is the boundary of that which contains, he adds that it contains all things which are moved, not simply, but those which are moved upward and downward, and the extremity and the middle. For the body which is moved in a circle, being itself the extremity, is not comprehended by the middle and the extremity, but only the bodies which are moved upward and downward. So the idea of the proper place of these things, explaining their movement, applies to upward and downward motion. Those are the natural motions of the mundane elements. But he does not appear to have added this in vain, but for the purpose of evincing that of the bodies which are moved upward, that which is placed above comprehends that which is placed beneath, just as fire comprehends air, and that the bodies which are moved downward are contained by that which is placed beneath. So again, Aristotle is evidently saying that the downward moving bodies are contained by the lowest, but also his own explicit statement above seems to contradict that. So it's, again, just a tension between two different lines of thought going here. The body, however, which contains becomes after a manner the form of that which is contained, which he says it has as being situated successively. For if the upward place gives form to bodies that are light, which then become light when they are in the upward place, so again, this gets us to the cause of gravity and levity. So the upward place is the form of light bodies and gives their levity, and the downward place is the form of heavy bodies and is the cause of the gravity, which then become light when they are in the upward place, but the downward place gives form to heavy bodies. the extremity upward is the form of fire because in this place it possesses its perfection. But fire is the form of air because the ascent of the latter is as far as to the former. So the place and the natural form of something is the same, or at least related. And again, the middle is the form of earth, but earth is the form of water because water, when it becomes situated in earth, as then having acquired its own form according to gravity, is at rest. So where it rests, that's the natural place of it, so it's the natural form, and so earth is that. So according to one aspect of Aristotle's reasoning, the earth should be the form of water, but according to another statement, not. Again, that tension is still there. And the extremes indeed are analogously forms, as giving a specific distinction to the bodies which are situated in succession. But the middles are analogous to matter, as acquiring a specific distinction from the extremes. For fire imparts levity to air, and earth gravity to water. So it's not just the upward place and the downward place, but fire and earth are the cause of gravity and levity. Vice versa, though. Simplicius adds, but that the mode of division of the four elements into the formal and material is different from that mode according to which heavy and cold bodies have the relation of matter, but light and hot bodies of form, Aristotle himself asserts elsewhere, and Theophrastus in his book on the generation of the elements. And Posidonius the Stoic, driving this distinction from these philosophers, everywhere uses it. Right. So, in one respect, I'm actually going to read this statement again. But that the mode of division of the four elements into the formal and material is different from that mode according to which heavy and cold have the relation of matter, but light and hot of form. Right, so in one respect, the composite elements, earth and fire, act as formal principles for the middle elements. But if you break down the properties of the compound elements, their lightness, their rarity, their density, or their hotness, coldness, their wetness, their dryness, those properties are arranged differently than the elements themselves in terms of what is above and what is beneath, which are formal, which are not formal. So the lighter is more formal. So here I think is how he tries to reconcile this statement. So if we're talking about simply the higher and the lower, or the rarer or the denser, or the hot and the cold, then the rarer and the hot are formal always in general, all else being equal, to the cold and the dense. But with the elements themselves, there's another ranking. So so that's why this distinction arises. Theophrastus uses it, Posidonius uses it, probably to try to reconcile what I am reading as simply an inconsistency in Aristotle's reasoning. So we have this fine distinction that the elements are form and matter to each other in one way, but then their properties are form and matter to each other in a slightly different way. Okay. So moving on to the new stuff finally. But to investigate why fire tends upward but earth downward is the same thing as to inquire why that which may be restored to health, if it is moved and changed so far as it may be restored to health, arrives at health. At least I think this is new stuff. It may be that I went further back than I thought, so this whole stream could potentially be redundant, but that's not necessarily hurting anybody. If that is the case, we're going to keep reading. Why fire tends upward but earth downward is the same thing as to inquire why that which may be restored to health, if it is moved and changed so far as it may be restored to health, arrives at health and not at whiteness. And in a similar manner with respect to everything else which may be changed in quality. Okay, so why earth tends downward? Well, because the downward is its proper place and proper form, just like that which is deranged from health can be restored to health and arrives at health because that's its proper form. So earth is the cause of downward because the downward is the form of earth. Moreover, that also which may be increased, when it is changed, so far as it may be increased, does not arrive at health, but at an excess of magnitude. In like manner, also with respect to each of these, one is changed in quality, but another in quantity. And in place, light bodies tend upward, but heavy downward, except that some things appear to contain in themselves the principle of mutation, viz., the heavy and the light, but others do not, but derive it externally, as that which may be restored to health, or that which may be increased. It's interesting that he classifies health, that which can be restored to health, as receiving its mutation towards health externally, because clearly, like, we also heal by our own devices. Sometimes, however, these are changed from themselves, and a little motion being produced in things external, the one arrives at health, but the other at increase. And since that which may be restored to health and that which is susceptible of disease are the same thing, if it is moved so far as it may be restored to health, it tends to health, but if it is moved so far as it may be diseased, it tends to disease. The heavy and the light, however, appear more than these to possess in themselves the principle of mutation, because the matter of these is most near to essence. Okay, so things that can be healthy or diseased can be pushed in either direction, more or less ambivalently. I think he should recognize that there's a natural tendency to the health over disease, but that which is heavy and or light by nature naturally moves to its own place and resists the attempt to move it in the contrary direction because it's nearer to essence, meaning it's nearer to the substrate of things. They're more basic. These natural bodies essentially are like the kind of Aristotelian substance, which is more the substrate of things. And so being simpler, their natural motion stands out, and they don't admit of contraries as much, perhaps. A token of which is this, that lation belongs to things that are entire and complete, and is last in the generation of motions, so that this motion will be the first and according to essence. Okay, so this motion being lation will be the first and according to essence. Even though it's last in the generation of motions. So this is a pretty enigmatic statement. We'll see what Simplicius says. Having shown that bodies which naturally tend upward and downward tend as to their proper form and perfection, and from a subsistence in capacity to a subsistence in energy of which they possessed the capacity, he now also confirms this from other motions. So it's not just the upward and downward. He shows, therefore, that as in other motions, the mutation according to nature from that which is in capacity to the characteristic property of accidents is into something else, the like also takes place in local motion. But, yeah, so we already compared aliation, right? Wasn't that a change in quality? I think that was the term. He compared that to the upward and downward with the health example, or the magnitude example. Now we're going to look at local motion besides the upward and the downward. But having said that things which are changed into health from themselves require a little external cooperation, he adds that that which may be restored to health and that which is susceptible of disease are the same thing, on which account if it is moved so far as it may be restored to health, it tends to health, but if so far as it may be diseased, it tends to disease. For everything is moved to that to which it possesses the power of being moved, collecting therefore that bodies which are locally moved, for these are the heavy and the light. No, he's just returning to the natural upward and downward motion of the elements here, not to some other kind of local motion. These, the heavy and the light, have the principle of motion in themselves more than other things which are naturally moved. He adds the cause why bodies which are locally moved are more perfect. But being now more perfect in energy they more contain in themselves the principle of motion. For on this account, in short, so local motion is said to be last, but also that motion will be first. I don't know why he says it's last, but except that, in the laws and in his argument concerning the different types of motion, I think local motion is like later. So first you have that which moves another but doesn't move itself. That's the first motion. And then you have that which moves itself in a revertive way. That can't be local motion. That's another kind of thing. And then you have, I guess, circulation, rotation, and then after that, I think local motion is like last among the motions. But I'm not clear why the fact that it's last means that it's more perfect and containing the principle of motion in itself more, not by virtue of that fact, but by virtue of the fact that the simple elements are simpler and don't contain the capacities of their opposite possible states as much. Because they're simpler, it's like imagine like a simple magnet that is one substance that naturally has this one attractive direction. It's gonna go by its own nature one way because it's simple. And now take a bunch of different metals, compound it together, and it has a complex electromagnetic field. It's not going to go necessarily one way or the other. It's going to be more susceptible of whichever way you happen to push it. So the more compound, complex body you would expect to be susceptible of outward motion more and to possess a unified principle of motion in itself less. But that doesn't seem to have much to do with the fact that local motion is last among the motions. We'll see if Simplicius explains it. But being now more perfect in energy, they more contain in themselves the principle of motion. For on this account, in short, animated natures, being more perfect than others, especially abound with the power of being moved by themselves. On this account, being more perfect in energy, like ensouled beings have their own power. I guess presumably the soul then is more perfect in energy. It's also a simple motion. Reversion is a simpler motion, but it's not quite, doesn't quite harmonize. For that which is imperfect and has not yet a being is moved by this, but by which also it is generated. Okay, so the body is generated by that form of the soul. The soul, as the entelechy of the body, is the actualized potential form of the body, and so is like the soul is more perfectly actuated, and so it is more cause. By this reasoning, more cause of the motion, and then the body, being generated by the soul, is susceptible of motion from without, from the soul. But he adds the cause of that which is locally moved, being more perfect, viz., because the matter of things thus moved is most near to essence, obscurely assigning the cause. So we acknowledge that this is obscure. That's good. For he calls matter the aptitude of these, and that which is incapacity, but the form which is perfective of them, essence. Okay, so I guess it's most near to essence, the simple bodies, because they have their simple form is actualized, unmingled, unalloyed. He calls the matter the aptitude of these, and that which is incapacity, but the form which is perfective of them, essence. So because their form is simpler and their matter is less dominant because it's not as compound, because of that, the locomotion is more perfect because it's more actual, because the form is dominant over the matter. Whereas a compound body, because it's not just one form that's being instantiated in it, it's the material aspect predominates, and its susceptibility of outward motion predominates. So now it's actually clearer. So that local motion, the natural local motion of simple bodies, their actual aspect, their form, is predominant over their material aspect. So they're closer to essence, not because they're the simplest bodies, but because the simplest forms instantiate unalloyed in them. And so their essential aspect predominates, whereas more compound bodies become more material and susceptible of motion from without. But the form which is perfected of them, essence. For everything which is in capacity is matter with respect to that which it is in capacity. And the essence of everything is defined according to the form which is perfective of it. Since, therefore, things which are locally moved are not changed according to anything which is inherent in them, but according to place alone, hence things which are now essentially perfect are near to local motion. So they're not going through alterations, they're not moved from without. The change that they undergo is simply according to place. So there it is. The fact that local motion is the last of the motions means that it to change local position is the simplest change you can exert. And so the natural, essential entelechy of the simple bodies, the capacity is simply to be moved to another place. And so the essential predominates, whereas a compound body that's going to go through some kind of alteration in quality or size or other properties, it is subject to outward change more, because it's not just going to be moved in position, it's going to be moved, changed in all these other ways. And so so the simple bodies are closer to essence because they simply change according to local motion, and also their form predominates over their matter to a greater extent. Okay. For the aptitude according to local motion proceeds not as to essence, but as to energy. So the change in local position proceeds not from an alteration in essence, but in activity. On which account also divine bodies do not disdain to be moved with this motion, because it possesses much of an efficacious nature. So the change in local motion is just an energy. Their essence is not altered. It's an activity of their essence to a greater extent. The energy, the actualization of their potential motion is more a result of their own essence. They contain that principle of motion in themselves, the simple bodies, and also kind of on the other side of the spectrum, the gods will be divine bodies is probably talking about the planets. They will go through locomotion because that's like a natural activity of their essence being unchanged, because they're divine, the same, the unchanged is superior to the different and altered. For to be changed in quality and increased, and still farther to be generated, are rather passions than energies, but locomotion is rather energy than passion. Right. So change in locomotion, especially when that locomotion comes from your own natural motive principle, is more active, more formal rather than material. To be changed in quality or increased involves more like you are becoming the matter to the change, whereas the motion is more you are the actor, more energy than passion. Okay. Hence, things which are locally moved, so far indeed as they are moved, have not yet acquired the perfection pertaining to this motion. That has to do with the Aristotelian definition of motion, the actualization of its potential insofar as it's being actualized or something. It involves like the incompleteness of the motion. For a thing to be in motion, its potential is not actual yet, but you're going through a transition from potential to the actual. Hence, things which are locally moved, so far as they are moved, have not yet acquired the perfection pertaining to this motion, but they will have the perfection, simple bodies, of their own essence and form in other respects. They're not yet, they're not potentially something according to their own inherent properties. They are potentially something according to where they might be, but that's the simplest and last of the motions they could go through. So that's not like they're not as deranged from their perfection by virtue of the fact of being estranged from their proper place as things which are not yet in their correct form, like a body that has to go through growth, maturation, morphogenesis, has to go through more before being realized in its potential. So it's further from essence. Like the body that a soul is developing is more matter, whereas the body, which is the natural simple body, is basically complete, except it just isn't necessarily in the right place. So those bodies are closer to essence, not in the sense that they're closer to the substrate, like I said before. I'm going to read this sentence again. Hence, things which are locally moved, so far indeed as they are moved, have not yet acquired the perfection pertaining to this motion, if they are moved to the full perfection and form of themselves according to this. Okay. But having arrived at their own place through locomotion, they acquire from this their own perfection, becoming that in energy which they were formerly in capacity alone. Aristotle, therefore, very properly says that the aptitude of these is most near to essence, since being essentially perfect, they require to energize alone. So their essence is already good, it's just there is a capacity to be in a particular place that becomes actualized, but they don't go through a bunch of other changes. They're like most close, they're most near to their proper essence. They just have to be put in the right place. They require to energize alone. And if they obtain this through motion from themselves, they require no other motions. But that they are near to perfection and more perfect than things which are moved in a different manner, he adduces two signs. One, that such a motion is the motion of things complete, that is, of things which are entire, essentially, and not so according to any one of the things which are changed in them. Right, so local motion, when all that you have is local motion, they're complete in other respects of their essence. So they're more perfect, therefore closer to their actualization. For things which are passing into existence, which are increasing and changing in quality, are not yet complete with respect to a subsistence by themselves. In the second place, he infers this from things which are locally moved, being the last in generation. So that was the most obscure. We said our interpretation of that was that the last of the motions is less essential to the thing being moved. Obviously, a change in your qualities is a bigger deal than a change in your place. So a change in your place being the last of the motions, if that's the only kind of motion you're going through, therefore you are closer to your actualization, you're more perfect. In the second place, he infers this from things which are locally moved being the last in generation, but things which are last in generation are more perfect. 4. In animals, things imperfect precede. So Simplicius is using a different line of reasoning. I think mine also works, but this is an interesting one. For animals, in animals, things imperfect precede the perfect in generation, viz. The seed and the menstruum, the gradual formation of the embryo, and that which is just born precede the perfection which the animal acquires in time. Yeah, so he's arguing that in general, things later, I don't know if this is a properly Platonic point or not, because how does that apply to a cyclical cosmos? Things prior are not universally less perfect in generation. Um, in fact, sometimes it's the opposite. Things prior can be more perfect in the generative sequence, like the myth from the Statesman, when the world is, you know, reset by Cronus, you enter Cronian age, then the past is more perfect than the present. And in general, they have the idea that like later generations are inferior to previous generations. Um, but in this respect, at least, in some cases, so I think I'm not sure that Simplicius's argument is actually as good as the one that I gave. That the last of the motions involves the least essential change, and so to be only moved locally is to undergo the least change, which means you were already more perfect, which means you were already closer to essence, or closer to, the fullness of your potential. The gradual formation of the embryo and that which is just born precede the perfection which the animal acquires in time. And in a similar manner in plants, each proceeds from the imperfect to the perfect, but that which is more perfect is prior in essence, as if for the sake of this, other things were pre-assumed. Right. Okay, so that which is more perfect is posterior in generation or time, but prior in essence. So that's an interesting distinction. Local motion also is posterior to other motions, both in animals and in inanimate natures. But local motion is posterior essentially, not just in generation, as we see in the 10th book of the Laws and in uh, wherever Aristotle gives the argument from motion in the Metaphysics. I don't know. Local motion also is posterior to other motions, both in animals and in inanimate natures. For animals, when they are now perfect, are moved according to place. And natural bodies, when perfect, acquire their natural local motion. Fire, indeed, when it tends to the extremity, but earth, when it tends to the middle. But change in quality precedes, and after this increase, and thus the motion according to place accedes, and especially in more perfect natures, such as animals. So a local motion is termed more perfect than a change in quality by nature, according to Simplicius. I don't know how that jives with the argument from motion for the first mover, but for these, when now perfect and complete, are moved with a local motion, adapted to animals. Hence, local motion will be the first according to essence, arriving posterior to other motions, but in both in time and order. So it's first according to essence, but last according to time. And I feel like there are some problems, some other possible tensions there, but it's a distinction worth remembering. Because, like, reversion upon oneself, intellectual reversion, is the first motion of souls, and that's not locomotion, and yet it is prior to locomotion. Um, mm, yeah, I don't know how I feel about this locomotion being held up high. I think it's only certain kinds of motion locomotion is going to be first. So he says a change in magnitude, a change in quality. So between those three, locomotion will be first. Maybe there are other types of motions involved in the metaphysics argument that aren't being counted here. So maybe we're talking specifically about like natural motions or motions of bodies per se. And then local motion will be the last that is energized, but the first according to essence. So I guess that's going to be the interpretation. Um, okay, let's see. We'll go ahead and read. When therefore air is generated from water, and the light from the heavy, it arrives at the upward place. At the same time, however, it is light and no longer generated, but is there. All right. So that's where we're going. We'll start with this sentence again next time. Hopefully, we can get to this tomorrow. We'll refresh ourselves on that and go on with Aristotle. So, some interesting stuff here. Um, I have mixed feelings about Simplicius's interpretation. We'll look at Aristotle's text and see where Aristotle falls more clearly. So, some issues of the rank of the different types of motions we should bear in mind and look for clues in other documents. To is local motion the first by nature, but the last in generation? Can we find other support for that? All right. Any other thoughts on the reading?
Nope.
Okay. I will go ahead and wrap up then. Thanks everybody for listening. Take care.
Thanks. See you later.
Yep. I'm gonna check.